Got a cozy spot picked out yet? We're about to dive into an emotional ride where honor, love, and family collide in a big way. Ever felt alone when the people closest to you didn't have your back? Today's story is like a warm hug just for you. Stick around till the end. You might just see a piece of yourself in it. Brian, 27, and Emily, 29, were college sweethearts, now married for 6 years with a bright-eyed 4-year-old daughter, Sophie. Their love story began in a lecture hall where Brian's quick wit and Emily's quiet strength sparked something undeniable. But their backgrounds couldn't be more different. Brian grew up in a working-class neighborhood, raised by a single mom who worked double shifts to keep the lights on. Emily, on the other hand, was born into a conservative, upper-middle-class family, living in a gated community where old-school values and polished appearances reigned supreme. Her parents, especially her father, Charles, 59, held tight to traditions that often felt like shackles to Brian. From the start, Brian and Charles were oil and water. Charles, a retired accountant with a knack for control, never warmed to his son-in-law. He saw Brian's blue-collar roots as a stain, a blemish on the family's carefully curated image. At family gatherings, Charles would toss out backhanded remarks about Brian's upbringing, how he lacked refinement or didn't know the value of a dollar. Brian, for his part, swallowed his pride. He'd clench his jaw, force a smile, and let the jabs slide for the sake of Emily and Sophie. Emily tried to play peacemaker, but her father's stubbornness was a wall she couldn't break through. Brian's patience, though, wasn't infinite. The tension simmered for years, but it boiled over one chilly Christmas Eve at Charles and Margaret's sprawling suburban home. The annual holiday party was a big deal: catered food, twinkling lights, and a guest list of neighbors and relatives who all seemed to share Charles's rigid worldview. Brian always felt out of place, like a guest in a museum where he wasn't allowed to touch anything. Sophie, in her red velvet dress, was the night's saving grace, toddling around with a contagious giggle that softened even the stuffiest guests. Emily, radiant in a green sweater, kept close to Brian, sensing his discomfort in the sea of judgmental eyes. The evening took a dark turn after dinner. Charles, flushed from too much eggnog, noticed his iPad was missing from the study. It wasn't just any tablet, it was his prized gadget, loaded with financial spreadsheets and family photos. He stormed into the living room, his voice cutting through the holiday chatter. "Where's Brian?" he demanded, eyes narrowing. Brian had stepped out to the garage to grab Sophie's coat, but to Charles, that brief absence was proof of guilt. "He was poking around my study earlier," Charles announced to the room, his tone dripping with accusation. "I bet he took it." The room fell silent. Emily's face flushed with disbelief. "Dad, that's ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp. But Charles doubled down. "People like him," he sneered. "They see something shiny and can't help themselves." The words hit Brian like a punch when he walked back in, Sophie's coat in hand. Guests stared, some whispering, others looking away. Brian's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. "I didn't take anything, Charles. You know that." Charles wasn't having it. Ignoring Emily's protests, he called the police, claiming a theft. Within 20 minutes, 2 officers arrived, their radios crackling in the festive air. They questioned Brian in front of everyone: neighbors, cousins, even little Sophie, who clung to her mom's leg, confused. "Sir, can you account for your whereabouts?" one officer asked, notepad in hand. Brian explained he'd only gone to the garage, but Charles interrupted, painting him as a shifty outsider. The officers searched Brian's car, his coat, even his phone, finding nothing. The iPad remained missing, and no charges were filed, but the damage was done. As the police left, the party resumed, but the mood was sour. Brian stood in the foyer, humiliated, his face burning with anger and shame. Emily, tears in her eyes, tried to apologize, but Brian just shook his head. "I didn't sign up for this," he said quietly, his voice raw. Sophie, sensing the tension, started to cry, and Brian scooped her up, holding her close. Margaret, Emily's mother, hovered nearby, saying nothing, her silence as deafening as Charles's accusations. The drive home was heavy. Emily stared out the window, her hands twisting in her lap. Brian gripped the steering wheel, replaying the night in his mind. He'd spent years trying to prove himself to Charles, to show he was worthy of Emily and Sophie. But that night, in front of everyone, he was reduced to a stereotypia thief, an outsider, unwelcome in the family he'd married into. The sting of it wasn't just Charles's words. It was the way no one, not even Margaret, had stood up for him. Back home, Sophie was tucked into bed, her tiny snores filling the quiet. Brian and Emily sat on the couch, the Christmas tree's lights casting soft shadows. "I can't keep doing this," Brian said, his voice breaking. "I love you, Em, but your dad is never going to see me as anything but trash." Emily reached for his hand, her eyes pleading. "He's wrong about you. I'll talk to him. We'll fix this." But Brian wasn't sure it could be fixed. The wound was too deep, and the question lingered. Could their love survive a family that seemed determined to tear them apart? The Christmas Eve humiliation was just the beginning for Brian. Charles, emboldened by the lack of consequences, took his vendetta to new lows. He started a subtle, but vicious campaign to tarnish Brian's name online. On neighborhood forums and social media groups, Charles posted veiled accusations, calling Brian untrustworthy and hinting at sticky fingers. He never named Brian outright, but the details references to Emily's husband, a working-class guy with no roots, made it clear who he meant. The posts spread like wildfire in their tight-knit community, where gossip was currency. Brian, once seen as the quiet guy who mowed his lawn on Saturdays, became a pariah. The fallout hit hard. Brian, a graphic designer, had been in the running for a senior role at a local ad agency, a step up that could have given his family some breathing room. But during the background check, the hiring manager stumbled across Charles's posts. The agency, wary of drama, passed on Brian without explanation. When he pieced it together, the rejection stung worse than the lost job. It was his reputation, his integrity, being chipped away by a man who'd never given him a chance. Brian tried confronting Charles, texting him to take the post down, but Charles ignored him, claiming free speech. Emily's mother, Margaret, stayed silent, as did the rest of Emily's family, unwilling to cross Charles's wrath. The isolation was suffocating. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Old college friends stopped texting back. Brian felt like he was living in a fishbowl, judged at every turn. But the deepest cut came from Emily. He'd always seen her as his partner, his rock. Yet, as Charles's attacks intensified, Emily didn't stand by him. Instead, she kept attending family events at her parents' house, taking Sophie along, even when Brian begged her not to. They're her grandparents, Emily argued, brushing off his concerns. "I can't just cut them off." To Brian, it wasn't about cutting ties, it was about protecting their daughter from a toxic environment and showing some loyalty to him. One night, after Sophie came home parroting something Charles had said about Daddy not being honest, Brian hit his breaking point. He sat Emily down in their dimly lit living room, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. "I need you to have my back, Em," he said, his voice slow but firm. "I'm not asking you to disown your dad. I just need you to stand up for me, to show Sophie her father ain't the villain he's making me out to be." Emily's response crushed him. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said, her tone exasperated. "If we just keep the peace, it'll blow over. Why do you have to make everything a fight?" Her words landed like a betrayal. Brian wasn't asking for a warg, was asking for a teammate. He'd spent years navigating her family's disapproval, biting his tongue to keep things civil. But now, when he was drowning in Charles's lies, Emily chose appeasement over alliance. She saw her father's behavior as a quirk to manage, not a line to draw. To Brian, it felt like she was choosing her family's comfort over his dignity. The loneliness crept in slowly, then all at once. Brian started staying late at his freelance gigs, not because he needed the hours, but because home felt like a battlefield. He'd kiss Sophie goodnight, her tiny arms around his neck, and wonder if she'd grow up hearing her grandfather's poison. Emily, meanwhile, doubled down on keeping the peace. She'd chat with her mom on the phone, laughing about Sophie's antics, as if Charles's actions were a minor hiccup. When Brian tried to talk about it, she'd shut down or change the subject. "Let's not dwell on it," she'd say, her eyes avoiding his. The strain seeped into their marriage like damp rot. Dinners were quiet, filled with small talk about bills or Sophie's preschool. The easy laughter they'd shared in college felt like a distant memory. Brian started questioning everything. Did Emily ever really see him as an equal? Had she married him despite her family's objections, or because she thought she could fix him? He didn't want to believe it, but the doubt gnawed at him. He'd lie awake at night, Emily steady breathing beside him, feeling more alone than he ever had. One evening, after another family brunch Emily attended without him, Brian found himself staring at an old photo on his phone, a candid shot of him and Emily at a campus coffee shop, her head thrown back in laughter, his arm around her. That version of them felt like a ghost. He didn't want to give up on their love, but he couldn't keep fighting alone. The question wasn't just whether Emily would finally stand up to her father, it was whether she'd choose their marriage over the family that seemed hell-bent on breaking it. As winter turned to spring, Brian faced a choice. He could keep swallowing the hurt, hoping Emily would come around, or he could demand the respect he deserved even if it meant risking everything. For now, he poured his energy into Sophie, reading her bedtime stories and shielding her from the storm. But the weight of Emily's silence grew heavier each day, and Brian knew something had to give. For months after the Christmas Eve debacle, the truth about Charles's missing iPad surfaced. Emily's sister, Laura, found it tucked under her teenage son's mattress. The boy, Ethan, had swiped it to play games, too scared to fess up after Charles's meltdown. Laura called Emily, embarrassed but casual, as if it were a minor mix-up. The news reached Brian through a curt text from Emily. They found the iPad. Ethan had it. No mention of an apology. No acknowledgement of the hell Brian had endured. He stared at the message, waiting for something more, a follow-up. A call, anything. Nothing came. Charles, predictably, offered no remorse. At the next family dinner, he acted as if the accusation had never happened, chatting about golf and the weather while passing the mashed potatoes. The rest of Emily's family followed his lead, sidestepping the incident like it was an awkward spill they'd rather not clean up. Margaret gave Brian a tight smile when he dropped Sophie off for a playdate, but her eyes darted away, complicit in the silence. For Brian, the lack of accountability was almost worse than the original insult. He'd been publicly humiliated, slandered online, and cost a career opportunity for nothing. And no one cared enough to make it right. Brian drew a line. He refused to set foot in Charles's house again, the place where he'd been reduced to a stereotype in front of strangers. He also banned Sophie from unsupervised visits with her grandparents. "I don't trust them to respect me around her," he told Emily, his voice steady but heavy. He wasn't out for revenge, didn't have the energy for that. But he wasn't going to pretend the pain hadn't happened, either. Sophie deserved a father who stood up for himself, and Brian was done bowing to a family that saw him as lesser. Emily, though, wanted to move on without addressing the wound. When Brian brought up the iPad or Charles's smear campaign, she'd sigh and say, "Can't we just let it go? It's over." To her, Brian's refusal to move forward was the problem, not her father's actions or her family's silence. "You're keeping this alive," she'd snap, frustration lacing her voice. "Why can't you just be the bigger person?" The words cut deep. Brian wasn't trying to hold a grudge. He was asking for acknowledgement, for someone to say, "You didn't deserve that." Instead, Emily treated his pain like an inconvenience, a hurdle to her family's fragile harmony. The rift in their marriage grew impossible to ignore. They still shared a bed, still co-parented Sophie with practiced efficiency, but the warmth was gone. Brian felt like a stranger in his own home, navigating a marriage that once felt like his anchor. He'd believed in their love throughout college, through Charles's disapproval, through every hurdle. But now, he was fighting alone. Emily's refusal to confront her father or defend Brian left him questioning everything. Was this still the partnership he'd signed up for? Could love survive when one person wouldn't stand up for the other? As spring bloomed, Brian wrestled with his next steps. He still loved Emilith's way her nose crinkled when she laughed, the quiet strength she showed when Sophie was sick. He adored Sophie, her crayon drawings and endless questions about the world. He wanted to save their family, to rebuild what they'd had. But love wasn't enough if it only flowed one way. Can you hold a marriage together? He wondered, when the other person won't reach for your hand. The question haunted him, lingering in the quiet moments after Sophie's bedtime stories or during his solitary drives to work. Brian knew he had to find himself again before he could keep fighting for a marriage he might be holding onto alone. He started small, reconnecting with old friends, sketching designs for himself instead of clients, taking Sophie to the park where her laughter drowned out his doubts. He wasn't ready to give up, but he wasn't ready to keep bleeding for a family that wouldn't heal the wound. For now, he stood at a crossroads, loving his wife and daughter fiercely, but unsure if that love could bridge the gap Emily refused to cross. The future was uncertain, but Brian was done waiting for someone else to validate his worth.